Orphan, raising her brother alone, knocked on the mountain man's cabin. "Please, be our father." A desperate plea echoed through the wilderness, carried by the voice of a child, forced to grow up too soon. The mountain man's solitary existence was about to collide with two broken hearts seeking shelter from life's cruelest storms. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The mountain loomed like a silent giant, its peak lost in a veil of mist that swirled and danced in the cold afternoon air. Ruth Garcia struggled with each step, her small frame bent forward under the weight of her brother. Her hands were raw and cracked from the climb, blood occasionally seeping from fresh cuts as she gripped rocks and branches to steady herself. Her breath came in ragged gasps, forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the mountain air. Jose lay limp against her back, his thin arms draped loosely around her neck. He hadn't spoken a word since they'd left Santa Lucia Hollow 3 days ago. The world they once knew had crumbled around them, their mother gone, their home lost to hunger and the violence that had swept through their community like wildfire. "Almost there, Jose," Ruth whispered, though she wasn't certain her brother could hear her through his fever-induced haze. "Dona Helena said the cabin is just beyond these trees." The path narrowed as Ruth pushed through a thicket of pine, her oversized boots slipping on loose stones. She was small for her age, but years of caring for her brother had made her stronger than she looked. Finally, through a clearing in the trees, she spotted it, a wooden cabin with smoke curling from its chimney. Her heart leaped with desperate hope. This was their last chance. Inside the cabin, Miguel Santos sat hunched by the fire, his broad shoulders curved inward, as if bearing an invisible weight. The former kind man of the valley had become a ghost of himself, haunted by memories he couldn't outrun. His calloused hands absently stoked the flames as shadows danced across the walls of his self-imposed prison. When the knock came, 3 distinct raps against the wooden door, Miguel froze. It had been years since anyone had climbed this high to seek him out. Years since he'd spoken more than a handful of words to another human being. Ruth knocked again, her knuckles brittle against the weathered wood. Silence pressed in from all sides, broken only by the whisper of wind through the trees and Jose's shallow breathing against her neck. She closed her eyes, summoning the last of her courage. If the mountain man turned them away, there was nowhere left to go. Miguel rose slowly, his joints protesting the movement. Something in that knock, desperate yet determined, pulled him toward the door, against his better judgment. His solitude, carefully maintained for years, was about to be broken by a sound that demanded an answer. Miguel Santos felt his heart thudding against his ribs as he crossed the worn wooden floor, each board protesting beneath his weight. The sound of knocking, so foreign after years of silence, had jolted him from his stupor by the fire. What stirred within him wasn't easily named. Fear, hope, or something more primal, like recognition intertwined with an old familiar ache. His calloused hand hesitated on the door latch. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, returning to his solitude. But something in the desperate rhythm of those knocks wouldn't let him. With a deep breath, he pulled the door open. There stood a girl, soaked to the bone, her small frame shivering violently in the mountain cold. Despite her obvious exhaustion, her eyes burned with fierce determination. On her back, a little boy clung limply, his face buried against her shoulder. Both children were far too thin, their clothes threadbare and mismatched. "I'm Ruth," she stammered through chattering teeth. "And this is Jose." She shifted her weight, adjusting her brother's position. "We got no one left." Her voice cracked slightly, but she squared her shoulders, lifting her chin with surprising dignity. "Please, be our father." The words hit Miguel like a physical blow. He felt something shatter inside him, a wall he'd built years ago, brick by brick, to keep the world and its pain at bay. Memories flooded back. A woman with bright eyes, a young boy's laughter, a life before isolation. The recluse stood frozen, studying the girl's face. Ruth Garcia wasn't begging. She was offering a deal, an arrangement born of desperation, but delivered with resolve. Her brother Jose hadn't made a sound, but Miguel could see his small fingers gripping his sister's jacket with what little strength he had left. The mountain wind howled around them, carrying snowflakes that melted against Ruth's damp hair. Miguel knew he should speak, say something, anything, but words had become strangers to him over the years of self-imposed silence. Instead of turning them away, as every instinct of self-preservation urged him to do, Miguel stepped back. He opened his door wider, a wordless invitation that went against everything he promised himself when he'd retreated to this cabin years ago. Ruth hesitated only briefly before stepping across the threshold, bringing with her the cold mountain air and the weight of two lost children's futures. As Miguel closed the door behind them, he understood with perfect clarity that his life of solitude had ended the moment he'd heard those knocks. Ruth was smaller than she should have been, her thin frame betraying months of hunger. Her arms remained locked around Jose, protective even in the relative safety of the cabin. The little boy's eyes darted around the unfamiliar space, wide with uncertainty but too exhausted to show fear. Miguel Santos pushed the heavy wooden door closed against the biting mountain air, the latch clicking with finality. When he turned to face the children, his voice emerged rough and halting, like an instrument long unused. "Sit," he managed, gesturing toward the hearth where embers glowed faintly beneath ash. Ruth obeyed without hesitation, sinking down beside the dying fire. Jose curled against her side, his small body trembling despite the cabin's shelter. The girl arranged her brother carefully, tucking his legs beneath him and brushing snow from his hair with practiced movements. Miguel watched them for a moment, then moved to the fireplace. He knelt and began working the coals, adding kindling with calloused hands that remembered the motions even after years of solitude. The flames caught quickly, casting dancing shadows across the cabin's sparse furnishings, a table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with jars and tools. Without speaking, he crossed to a wooden trunk in the corner and pulled out a faded quilt, its pattern barely visible beneath years of wear. He returned and draped it over both children, careful to avoid touching them, his eyes fixed on the floor rather than meeting Ruth's gaze. The girl pulled the fabric tight around her brother's shoulders, her movements gentle despite her own exhaustion. The warmth seemed to ease something in Jose, whose breathing gradually slowed into a more peaceful rhythm. "I can help," Ruth said softly, her voice small but determined in the quiet cabin. "Chop wood, carry water, sew. Mama taught me everything." She straightened her spine as she spoke, as though trying to appear larger, more useful. Her hands, raw from cold and labor, fidgeted with the edge of the quilt. Miguel shook his head, moving away to stoke the fire again. "I don't need help." The words came out harsher than intended, echoing in the space between them. He had grown accustomed to silence, to the absence of need or obligation. These children, with their hungry eyes and desperate journey, threatened the careful emptiness he had built around himself. Ruth watched him, her face a mask of practiced patience. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it filled the cabin nonetheless. "But we do." 3 simple words that hung in the air, impossible to dismiss. Miguel's shoulders tensed as he stood with his back to her, caught between the instinct to protect and the desire to remain untouched by the world's sorrows. Miguel poured steaming water into an old tin mug, his movements deliberate and practiced. The vessel, dented from years of use, seemed to hold more than just the hot liquid as he extended it toward Ruth. She accepted with both hands, her small fingers wrapping around the warmth as if it were precious treasure. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. The quiet settled between them like a third presence in the cabin, heavy yet somehow comforting. Jose had finally succumbed to exhaustion, his small chest rising and falling in the rhythm of deep sleep. The fire grew stronger as Miguel added another log, sending shadows dancing across the rough-hewn walls of his solitary home. From the corner of his eye, Miguel studied the girl. Ruth's hands were raw and cracked from exposure, her knuckles reddened from cold and labor. The boots she wore were clearly meant for someone much larger, perhaps salvaged or gifted out of necessity. Despite her obvious exhaustion, her spine remained stubbornly straight, a testament to a pride that hardship had failed to break. "You walked up the mountain?" he finally asked, breaking the silence with his raspy, underused voice. Ruth nodded, taking a careful sip from the mug. "From Santa Lucia Hollow." Miguel's eyebrows rose slightly. That was 3 valleys south, a journey that would challenge even a grown man with proper supplies. For a girl and a young child, it bordered on impossible. The trek would have taken them through dangerous terrain, exposed to the elements and whatever else lurked in the wilderness. "How many days?" he asked, unable to mask his surprise. "4," she answered simply, as though discussing a short stroll rather than an arduous journey that could have claimed their lives. Miguel shook his head, a mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration crossing his weathered features. He stoked the fire again, buying time before asking the question that troubled him most. "Who told you I was here?" Ruth lowered the mug to her lap, her eyes meeting his directly for the first time. There was something in her gaze, a wisdom far beyond her years, tempered by experiences no child should endure. "A preacher said once you were kind," she replied. "Dona Helena remembered the trail from when she was young. She said you helped people before you came up here." Miguel turned away, uncomfortable with the mention of his past life. The recluse hadn't expected his former reputation to reach him here, in this self-imposed exile. He hadn't expected anyone to remember the man he used to be, certainly not well enough to send desperate children to his door. "That was a long time ago," he muttered, more to himself than to Ruth. The girl didn't respond, just cradled the mug closer to her chest, her eyes drifting to her sleeping brother as the mountain night deepened around them. Miguel stared into the fire, his jaw tight with unspoken memories. The flames danced in his hollow eyes, reflecting years of solitude. "I'm not that man anymore," he said, the words scraping against the silence like stones. Ruth's reply came gentle but firm, her small frame somehow filling the space between them. "Maybe you don't have to be. Maybe just tonight. Just long enough to keep Jose warm." There was no pleading in her voice, only the practical wisdom of someone who had learned to negotiate survival. The mountain recluse gave no answer, but his actions spoke volumes. He rose stiffly and fetched a dented pan from the shelf, moving with the deliberate grace of a man accustomed to doing everything alone. Miguel began to cook, scrounging what little he had from his meager stores, a handful of cornmeal, dried beans soaked that morning, and a hard crust of bread that he softened in the broth. Ruth watched every motion, her eyes tracking his hands with the calculation of someone who had learned to read people's intentions through their smallest movements. There was no fear in her gaze, only assessment, memorization, preparation. She was used to being in charge, to staying alive, to making do with less than nothing. Her back remained straight, despite the exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. "You know how to stretch food," Miguel observed, breaking the silence as he stirred the pot. "Had to," Ruth answered, her attention shifting momentarily to Jose, who had curled up beneath the quilt, his small chest rising and falling in the rhythm of exhausted sleep. "After Mama died, we had days when a potato had to feed us both." Miguel nodded, understanding more than words could convey. He'd known hunger too, though he chose not to speak of it. When the simple stew was ready, Ruth gently roused her brother. The girl took the cracked bowl Miguel offered and carefully blew on each spoonful before bringing it to José's lips. The child ate slowly, his eyes heavy with sleep. "Good?" Ruth asked him softly. José nodded, the barest hint of movement. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, a small smile broke through Ruth's weathered composure. Not the broad grin of a carefree child, but the quiet relief of a caretaker seeing a basic need met. It transformed her face, revealing for just a moment the girl she might have been in another life. Miguel looked away, uncomfortable with the intimacy of the moment, but something had shifted in the cabin's atmosphere, something as subtle as the changing direction of smoke from the fire, yet just as undeniable. The fire crackled softly in the hearth as José's breathing deepened into sleep. Ruth Garcia tucked the worn quilt tighter around her brother's small frame, her fingers lingering protectively over his shoulder. The cabin had fallen into a comfortable quiet, broken only by the occasional pop from burning wood and the low moan of wind finding its way through the cabin's aging joints. Miguel Santos sat across from them, whittling a small piece of wood with practiced strokes. His eyes occasionally drifted to the children, still unsure of the strange turn his solitary existence had taken. Ruth caught him looking and didn't turn away. "You don't talk much," she observed, her voice barely above a whisper to avoid waking José. Miguel's hands stilled for a moment. "No need," he answered, the words emerging rough from disuse. Ruth considered this, her eyes far older than her years. "Sometimes need don't ask," she replied with quiet wisdom that startled him. The corner of her mouth turned up, almost a smile, but not quite. It was the closest thing to lightness he'd seen on her face since she'd arrived, exhausted and desperate on his doorstep. The silence between them settled again, but something had shifted. Miguel returned to his carving, the small knife making delicate cuts in the pine. "Do you believe in God?" Ruth asked suddenly, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. The question caught Miguel off guard. His hands stopped moving, and he stared at the half-formed figure in his palms. Memories flickered across his face, of prayers once spoken, of faith once held, of unanswered pleas during the darkest moments of his life. "I used to," he finally admitted, the words heavy with things unsaid. Ruth nodded, accepting his answer without judgment. "I still do," she said simply. She stroked José's hair as he stirred slightly in his sleep. "Mama said he watches closest over those with the least." Miguel didn't respond, but something in his expression softened. Outside, snow began to fall, tiny flakes drifting past the single window, illuminated briefly by the firelight before disappearing into the darkness. The silence between them had transformed, no longer the tense, wary quiet of strangers forced together, but something shared, almost comfortable. Ruth's shoulders relaxed slightly, perhaps for the first time since arriving at the cabin. "It's snowing," Miguel observed, nodding toward the window. "Good," Ruth replied, "covers our tracks." The simple statement revealed volumes about the life she'd led. Always watching, always careful, always prepared for danger. Miguel recognized that vigilance. It mirrored his own. The fire popped loudly, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. José didn't stir. Ruth's eyes grew heavy, though she fought against sleep, her body still on guard. Morning broke gray and cold over the mountain cabin. Miguel Santos awoke with a jolt, his body still trained to rise before dawn despite years of solitude. The embers in the fireplace cast a faint orange glow across the small room, illuminating the two figures huddled together on the floor. Ruth and José Garcia were curled like kittens near the dying fire, a picture of vulnerability that made Miguel's chest tighten. The girl's arm was draped protectively over her brother, even in sleep maintaining her role as guardian. Their boots stood neatly beside them, revealing mismatched socks with holes at the toes. The boy's tiny fist clutched the edge of the quilt, as if afraid someone might take this newfound warmth away. Miguel moved with the careful silence of a man accustomed to being alone, afraid that any sudden noise might shatter this fragile moment of peace. He added 2 logs to the fire, coaxing the flames back to life without making a sound. The routine was familiar. He'd done it countless mornings, yet today felt different, with other breathing bodies in his space. Ruth's eyes snapped open the moment Miguel's shadow crossed her face. There was no gradual awakening, no stretching or yawning, just instant alertness, the vigilance of someone who had learned to sleep with one eye open. Her gaze tracked his movements, not with fear, but with the careful assessment of a child who had learned to read adults quickly. "You sleep?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse, barely above a whisper to avoid waking Jose. "A little," she replied. Her voice was small but steady, a quiet acknowledgement of the shelter he had provided. She didn't move from her position beside her brother, maintaining her protective stance even as she spoke. Miguel nodded, unsure how to respond. He turned away, busying himself with morning tasks, checking the water bucket, arranging kindling for later use, but her simple words echoed in his mind. It had been years since anyone had acknowledged his presence, his actions, his existence. Years since anyone had thanked him, even in that subtle, understated way. He glanced back at the girl, who was now gently stroking her brother's hair as the boy continued to sleep. There was something in her eyes, not just weariness or worry, but a flicker of something Miguel had almost forgotten. Hope. It was tentative, fragile, but unmistakably there. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Miguel felt the weight of being needed. It terrified him more than any storm or wild animal ever could. The world outside had transformed overnight. A thick blanket of pristine snow covered every surface, turning the rugged mountain landscape into a silent white kingdom. Miguel Santos rose before dawn, as was his habit from years of solitary living. He pulled on his worn boots and heavy coat, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air of the cabin. Outside, Miguel moved with practiced efficiency. First, he checked the small chicken coop where 3 scrawny hens huddled together for warmth. They would provide no eggs today, but at least they had survived the night. Next, he split kindling with precise swings of his axe, the sharp crack echoing across the stillness. The physical labor warmed his body as he worked, his muscles remembering the rhythm despite the cold numbing his fingers. At the water trough, Miguel broke the layer of ice that had formed overnight. The task was harder than usual, the ice thicker from the bitter cold that had settled in. He filled his bucket, the water so cold it burned his skin, and trudged back toward the cabin, his footprints the only disruption in the perfect white expanse. When he pushed open the door, Miguel was greeted by unexpected warmth and a familiar smell. The cabin was filled with the comforting aroma of oats cooking over the fire. Ruth had somehow stirred the dying embers back to life and managed to prepare a simple breakfast. She sat cross-legged on the floor beside her brother, carefully feeding spoonfuls of the hot cereal to Jose. The young boy accepted each bite quietly, his eyes still heavy with sleep. Miguel noticed immediately that Ruth's own bowl sat untouched beside her. "You made this?" Miguel asked, unable to hide his surprise. He set the water bucket down by the door, removing his snow-covered boots. Ruth looked up, her small face serious. "I watched you last night," she explained simply. "Saw where you keep things," Miguel grunted, moving closer to the fire to warm his hands. The girl's resourcefulness unsettled him. It reminded him of someone he once knew. "Don't get used to it," he muttered, reaching for the ladle to serve himself. Ruth continued feeding her brother, her movements gentle but efficient. "I don't get used to much," she replied without looking up. The simple statement hung in the air between them. Miguel paused, studying the child before him. There was no self-pity in her words, no bid for sympathy, just a statement of fact. He recognized in her response a quiet defiance that came not from disrespect or rebellion, but from years of surviving, when survival seemed impossible. It wasn't sass, it was strength. Miguel ate in silence, watching as Ruth finally took a small portion for herself, only after ensuring Jose had eaten his fill. The morning light filtered through the cracks of the cabin's wooden shutters, casting thin golden lines across the worn table. Miguel had placed 3 wooden bowls of steaming oatmeal before them, the small portion in each revealing the scarcity they faced without needing words. Ruth helped Jose settle on a stack of folded blankets so he could reach his bowl, her movements gentle but efficient. They ate in silence, the only sounds being the scrape of spoons against wood and the occasional crackle from the fire. Jose, who had barely spoken since their arrival, suddenly straightened up, his eyes widening. "Bird," he mumbled, pointing one small finger toward the shutter. The single word hung in the air like something precious. Ruth's face transformed with a smile that reached her tired eyes. "You see a bird, Baby Blue?" she asked, her voice softer than Miguel had heard it before. The tenderness she reserved for her brother was a stark contrast to the hardened exterior she presented to the world. Miguel rose from his seat and moved to the window, peering through the narrow crack in the wooden slats. The flash of vibrant blue against the snow-covered branches confirmed the child's observation. "He's right," Miguel said, surprised. "Blue jay out there, flitting between the pines." Returning to his seat, Miguel studied Jose, who had returned to his breakfast, seemingly satisfied with his brief interaction with the world. "Your brother don't talk much," he observed, not unkindly. Ruth shrugged, her shoulders carrying the weight of memories too heavy for her small frame. "He used to," she said simply, "before Mama died." Her eyes remained fixed on her bowl, avoiding the pity she'd grown accustomed to seeing when people learned of their circumstances. Miguel nodded, not pressing for details. The mountain had taught him that some wounds needed silence to heal, and he recognized the shape of grief that surrounded both children. It was a familiar shadow, one that had kept him company for years. "He'll come around," Miguel said quietly, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. "If he's got the right soil to grow in." The words emerged from some forgotten part of himself, something the solitude hadn't completely erased. Ruth looked up at him then, her eyes calculating, measuring his words against all the broken promises she'd survived. She didn't respond, but Miguel could see her weighing whether to believe him, whether this cabin might actually become the sanctuary they desperately needed. Outside, the blue jay called once more, before taking flight, disappearing into the vast whiteness of the mountain morning. Around midday, a distant sound broke the cabin's silence. The rhythmic thud of hooves crunching through snow grew steadily louder, approaching from the eastern trail. Miguel Santos tensed immediately, his weathered hand reaching for the rifle, propped against the wall. "Stay inside," he ordered Ruth, his voice low but firm. "Keep away from the windows." Ruth nodded, her small frame moving with practiced efficiency. She gathered Jose into her arms and retreated to the shadowy corner behind the wood stove. The young boy didn't protest, seeming to understand the gravity in his sister's movements as she tucked them both out of sight. Miguel positioned himself by the door, rifle ready, his breath measured and controlled. Through the frosted window, a figure gradually materialized from the white landscape, a man leading a heavily laden mule through the deep snow. "Joao Costa," Miguel muttered, recognizing the trapper's distinctive gait. He kept the rifle ready nonetheless, stepping onto the porch with caution etched into every line of his face. The visitor raised a gloved hand in greeting. Joao was bundled in layers of animal hides, his beard frosted with ice crystals. The mule behind him carried stacks of firewood, bound with rope, its breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Just passing through," Joao called out, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Thought you might want to know. Storm's coming. Big one. 3 days, maybe 4. Miguel lowered his weapon slightly, but maintained his position. "Appreciate the warning." Joao's eyes flicked toward the cabin, noting the fresh footprints in the snow, too small to be Miguel's. "Company these days?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Nothing that concerns others," Miguel replied evenly. The trapper nodded, seeming to understand the boundaries. "Fair enough. Need anything before I head down to the valley?" "We're set," Miguel answered, the "we" slipping out before he could catch himself. Joe's eyebrows rose slightly, but he asked no further questions. He adjusted the mule's load, tipped his hat, and continued along the path that wound through the pines. Miguel watched until both man and animal disappeared into the tree line. When he returned inside, Ruth had already emerged from hiding, Jose clinging to her side. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Trapper. Trades furs in the valley," Miguel replied, setting his rifle down. "No danger." But even as he spoke the words, a disquiet settled in his chest. Joao was no threat, but his knowledge of visitors at the cabin could travel. Miguel glanced at the two children, unexpected company under his roof, and wondered how long their fragile peace would last before the world below found them. The darkness inside the cabin was absolute when Ruth's scream pierced the night. It wasn't loud, more like a choked gasp torn from her throat, but in the silence of the mountain, it might as well have been thunder. Her small body shot upright, hands clutching at air, eyes wide but seeing something far away. Miguel Santos was beside her in seconds, moving with the instinctive speed of someone who had spent years listening for danger in the night. One weathered hand found her trembling shoulder, while the other gripped his hunting knife, ready to face whatever threat had caused such terror. "Dreaming?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse, but surprisingly gentle. Ruth nodded, unable to speak at first. Tears carved silent paths down her dirt-smudged cheeks, glinting in the dying ember's light. Jose stirred beside her, but didn't wake, his small body curled tight against the cold, one tiny fist clutching the edge of the worn quilt. "I dream of a wagon," she finally whispered, her voice catching. "Every time it's the same. The wheel breaks, then everything's turning over. Mama screaming my name, telling me to grab Jose." She swallowed hard, her eyes focused on something Miguel couldn't see. And then after, when she was already gone, Jose crying for her. He cried for 3 days straight until his voice gave out. Miguel settled beside her on the floor, his back against the rough-hewn wall. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. What comfort could there be for such loss? Instead, he sat in silence, his presence solid and unwavering in the darkness. It was the kind of companionship only those who truly understood grief could offer. Ruth wiped her face with her sleeve, her breathing still uneven. "Sometimes I think I hear her voice calling us home." "That don't ever stop," Miguel said quietly, staring into the dying fire. "Not completely." In the stillness that followed, Ruth reached out hesitantly, her small fingers finding his calloused hand. The touch lasted only moments, brief as a bird lighting on a branch, before she withdrew, curling protectively around her brother once more. Miguel remained where he was, watching as her breathing gradually slowed and deepened. He knew he should return to his own pallet, but something kept him rooted there. A protective instinct he'd thought long dead, awakened by this fierce, fragile girl and her silent brother. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird called. Inside, 3 broken people breathed together in the darkness, forming something that wasn't yet trust, but was no longer merely survival. The next day dawned with a biting chill that seeped through the cabin walls. Miguel Santos rose before the sun, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. He pulled on his worn boots and heavy coat, moving quietly to avoid waking the children. The forest outside had transformed overnight, blanketed in pristine white that muffled every sound. Branches hung low under the weight of snow, creating a stillness that felt almost sacred. Miguel trudged through knee-deep drifts, checking his traps with practiced efficiency. His calloused hands worked quickly despite the cold. retrieving a plump rabbit from one of the snares. At the stream, he broke through the thin layer of ice to fill his bucket with water. The mountain man paused, scanning the surrounding trees. Something felt different today. Not threatening, just changed. Perhaps it was simply having others depending on him again. When he returned to the cabin, smoke was already curling from the chimney. Miguel pushed open the door to find Ruth up and moving about his small kitchen area. Her dark hair was neatly braided down her back, and she stood on tiptoes to reach the cooking pot. She was stirring a pot of oats over the fire with the confidence of someone who had been cooking for years, which, Miguel realized, she probably had been. Jose remained asleep, curled beneath the quilt, his small chest rising and falling peacefully. "You hunted?" Ruth asked, glancing at the rabbit dangling from his hand. "Trapped," Miguel replied, hanging his coat on a peg by the door. He placed the bucket of water near the fire to warm. Ruth eyed the rabbit with a practical assessment that seemed out of place on such a young face. "That'll last 2 days if we stretch it," she observed, already calculating how to make the most of their limited resources. He grunted in response, studying her as she returned to the oats. There was something in her movements, efficient, deliberate, nothing wasted. She carried herself with her mother's weariness, the kind that comes from too many burdens too early in life. But there was something else there too, something older and deeper, hard-won, unyielding like the mountain itself. "You know how to prepare it?" he asked, nodding toward the rabbit. "Yes," she answered simply. "Mama taught me everything." Miguel nodded, understanding what remained unspoken. This child had been preparing to survive on her own long before she needed to. He watched as she tested the oats with a wooden spoon, her small hands steady and sure. "I'll skin it outside," he said, moving toward the door again. "Less mess." Ruth nodded, already turning her attention to her brother, who was beginning to stir under the blankets. The girl moved between tasks with practiced ease, as though she'd been caring for both Jose and this cabin her entire life. The morning chill persisted inside the cabin as they gathered around the small table. Ruth Garcia carefully spooned the hot oatmeal into Jose's bowl first, blowing on each spoonful before feeding her brother. Her own portion sat untouched, steaming in the cool air. Miguel observed the ritual with quiet attention, noting how the girl's movements were practiced and methodical, like someone who had been caring for others far longer than any child should. When they finished the meager breakfast, Miguel reached into his pocket and pulled out his last piece of dried apple, wrinkled and brown, but sweet nonetheless. He extended his hand toward Ruth, offering the treat without words. "Thank you," she murmured, accepting the gift with solemn gratitude. Without hesitation, she broke the dried fruit in half, examining both pieces carefully before handing the visibly larger portion to Jose. The boy's eyes lit up as he took the offering, the rare sweetness, a treasure in their harsh world. "You do that a lot," Miguel observed, his voice rough from disuse. Ruth looked up, puzzled. "What?" "Give the bigger piece," he clarified, gesturing toward Jose, who was savoring every nibble of the apple. She looked down at her hands, suddenly self-conscious. "It's what Mama did," she answered simply. Her fingers traced invisible patterns on the wooden table, memories clearly washing over her. Miguel nodded, understanding more than he let on. He'd seen that kind of sacrifice before, the kind that parents make without thinking. "What would she say about all this?" he asked, genuinely curious about the woman who had raised such resilient children. Ruth hesitated, chewing her lip as she considered the question. Jose watched her face, as if also waiting for the answer. "She'd say it wasn't smart," Ruth finally replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Coming up the mountain with winter coming, trusting a stranger." She paused, looking around the cabin with its crackling fire and sturdy walls. "Then she'd ask if we were warm, if we had enough to eat." Her eyes met Miguel's, steady and clear. "And if we said yes, she'd say, 'Then you did right.'" Miguel absorbed her words, feeling their weight. He recognized in Ruth the same fierce protection he'd once felt for his own family, the willingness to risk everything for those you love. "Your mama sounds wise," he offered, the closest thing to a compliment he'd given since they arrived. Ruth nodded, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. She was. She took a small bite of her apple piece, savoring it, as if it contained all the sweetness left in the world. She always knew what mattered most. By midday, thick clouds rolled across the sky, darkening the landscape and promising another heavy snowfall. Ruth Garcia worked methodically outside the cabin, her small frame bent against the wind as she gathered fallen branches and kindling. Despite the patched woolen gloves Miguel had found for her, her fingers had turned an angry red, raw from cold and work. She stacked the wood precisely, moving with the efficiency of someone who had learned survival through necessity rather than choice. Miguel Santos watched from the doorway, struck by how the girl worked without a single complaint. She hauled armfuls of kindling like someone who had done this her entire life, arranging them carefully by size. There was something in her movements that reminded him of himself, the careful conservation of energy, the deliberate planning that came from knowing resources were precious. "You ever lived outside the hollow?" Miguel asked suddenly, breaking the silence between them. Ruth looked up, brushing a strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist. "No," she answered simply. "Then how'd you know how to find me?" He stepped closer, genuinely curious now. The mountain paths were treacherous, even for those who knew them well. The girl hesitated, adjusting her grip on the bundle of sticks. "Mama's friend, Dona Helena, remembered the trail from when she was a girl." She placed the kindling carefully into the growing pile. "She drew me a map before we left." Miguel's expression tightened. He hadn't heard Helena's name in years. The woman had been kind once, bringing food to his cabin in those first dark months after everything fell apart. "She tell you what kind of man I was?" he asked, his voice rough with something between fear and resignation. Ruth nodded, her eyes meeting his directly. "She said you once carried a boy 5 miles in the snow to the doctor." She paused, then added quietly, "He didn't make it, but you carried him the whole way." The words hung in the cold air between them. Miguel felt the old weight pressing against his chest, the memory of the boy's slight body growing colder in his arms with each desperate step through the blizzard. He'd been too late, too slow. The failure that had driven him to this mountainside, to this solitude. Ruth returned to her work, giving him the space to process her words. She didn't offer pity or questions, just continued stacking wood with those small, capable hands. In her quiet acceptance, Miguel recognized something he hadn't expected to find on his mountain: understanding. Miguel stilled, his weathered hands frozen mid-motion. The air between them crackled, not from the winter cold seeping through the cabin walls, but from something deeper, like old wounds reopening. His eyes, which had carefully avoided meeting Ruth's directly for days, now fixed on her with an intensity that made the girl straighten her spine. "You shouldn't have come here," he muttered, his voice rough as bark. The words hung heavy in the small space, but lacked the bite they might have held when she first arrived. Ruth shrugged, her thin shoulders rising beneath her too-large sweater. "Maybe not, but we did." The simplicity of her answer carried the weight of all their impossible choices. She didn't apologize or explain further. Survival had taught her economy with words. That night, as darkness wrapped around the cabin like a shroud, Jose's breathing changed. It started as a slight catch, then developed into a dry, papery cough that deepened as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Ruth sat up with him, her small body curved protectively around her brother's as she rocked gently beside the dying fire. Her eyes never left his face, watching each labored breath with the vigilance of someone who had already lost too much. Miguel moved about the cabin, adding wood to the fire, his movements deliberate yet uncertain. He'd grown unaccustomed to caring for anyone but himself. "He's sick often?" he finally asked, breaking the rhythm of Jose's coughing. Ruth looked up, shadows dancing across her face. "Only when he's cold," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames. Her hand continued its steady motion, rubbing small circles on her brother's back. The gesture seemed both instinctive and learned, something she might have seen their mother do countless times before. Miguel watched them for a long moment before crossing to an old trunk in the corner. He rummaged through its contents until he found a small, dented tin. The metal caught the firelight as he carried it back to Ruth. "Juniper oil," he explained, unscrewing the lid to reveal a pungent, earthy scent that immediately filled the cabin. "Mix it with heat. Won't cure him, but it'll ease his lungs." His instructions were sparse but precise, like everything else about him. Ruth took the tin with both hands, her fingers brushing against Miguel's calloused ones. "Thank you," she murmured, the simple gratitude carrying more weight than elaborate speeches. As she carefully applied the oil to Jose's chest, the boy's breathing gradually eased. Miguel retreated to his chair by the window, but his eyes remained on the children, the girl who mothered her brother with ancient wisdom, and the boy whose trust was as fragile as morning frost. The cabin creaked with unrest as darkness settled over the mountain. Jose Garcia's coughing punctuated the night, each rasping breath causing Ruth to wince as she sat beside her brother's makeshift bed. Her small fingers worked methodically across his back, tracing circles that her mother had once drawn on her own when winter chills took hold. Across the room, Miguel Santos perched by the window, his weathered frame a silhouette against the moonlit snow. The rifle lay across his knees, not aimed but ready, his ears strained for sounds beyond the wind and the boy's labored breathing. "Try the juniper again," he whispered, his voice barely carrying across the room. Ruth nodded, reaching for the tin of herbs. The pungent smell filled the cabin as she warmed the mixture between her palms before applying it to Jose's chest. The child stirred but didn't wake, his small face flushed with fever. "He's warmer than before," she said, concern etching lines around her eyes that made her look far older than her years. Miguel rose silently, crossing to them. He placed a calloused hand on the boy's forehead. "Fever's fighting the cold. That's good." He returned to his post, eyes scanning the tree line where shadows seemed to shift and dance. Sleep came in fragments that night. Ruth dozed sitting upright, her head occasionally dropping to her chest, before another cough from Jose would jerk her awake. Miguel didn't sleep at all, his body tensed like a trap ready to spring. Dawn broke with an eerie stillness. The recluse stepped outside while Ruth finally succumbed to exhaustion, curled protectively around her brother. The fresh snow around the cabin told a story Miguel could read as clearly as tracks in mud. Near the western edge of the clearing, boot prints approached from the forest. Large, deep impressions indicating a heavy man who had come within 20 paces of the cabin before turning back. When Ruth awoke, Miguel was standing in the doorway, his face grim. Someone was watching, he told her, closing the door against the biting cold. Came close in the night. Ruth didn't flinch. Her eyes, already old with worry, simply absorbed this new threat as she had absorbed so many others. Jose stirred beside her, oblivious to the danger that had crept so near. "Will they come back?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the fear Miguel could see in her shoulders. He checked the rifle's chamber, a metallic click breaking the silence. "If they're smart, no." His eyes met hers, an unspoken promise passing between them. "If not, I'll be ready." Ruth nodded, understanding the weight behind his words. For the first time since climbing the mountain, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps they weren't alone in their fight anymore. The cabin had grown quieter over the past few days, as if the walls themselves were softening around them. Ruth wandered through the small space, while Miguel chopped wood outside and Jose napped peacefully by the fire, his breathing finally clear of that worrying rattle. Her fingers traced the rough-hewn shelves, lingering over the few possessions Miguel had kept in his solitude. In the corner stood a small wooden drawer, its handle worn smooth from years of use. Ruth hesitated, her conscience battling curiosity before the latter won. She slid it open slowly, wincing at the creak. Inside lay folded papers, a carved wooden bird, and beneath them, face down, a simple wooden frame. She lifted it carefully, turning it over to reveal a photograph, edges yellowed with age. 3 faces looked back at her, a woman with bright, kind eyes that crinkled at the corners, a young boy with a gap-toothed grin, and Miguel. But this wasn't the Miguel she knew. This man was younger, shoulders unburdened, the ghost of a smile playing across his lips. His arm wrapped protectively around the woman's shoulders while she held the boy close. Ruth sank to the floor, the photograph heavy in her small hands. The faces told a story she understood without words, of happiness that existed before it was stolen away. She recognized that same hollow look in her own reflection whenever she caught it in still water. The door creaked open, and Miguel Santos entered, bringing with him a gust of cold air and the scent of pine. He shook snow from his coat, stomping his boots before freezing at the sight of Ruth with the frame. "You still have this?" she asked softly, not accusingly, but with genuine wonder that he could bear to keep such a reminder close. Miguel crossed the room in 3 strides, his face unreadable. Ruth braced herself for anger, but instead he knelt beside her, taking the frame with a gentleness that seemed to contradict his calloused hands. His thumb brushed over the woman's face, leaving a smudge that he quickly wiped away. "Because forgetting didn't work," he said simply, his voice rough like stones tumbling down a hillside. Ruth nodded, understanding more than words could say. She tried forgetting too, tried to forget her mother's voice. The way their home had smelled of cinnamon on good days, how the wagon wheels had looked spinning uselessly in the air after the accident. Forgetting never worked. "Who were they?" she whispered. Miguel's eyes remained fixed on the photograph. "My wife, Elena. My son, Mateo." He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. The absence in the cabin spoke volumes. Ruth reached out, her small hand resting briefly on his arm before withdrawing. They sat in silence, 2 souls carrying similar wounds, while Jose slept on, unaware of the ghosts surrounding them. The night wrapped around the cabin like a thick blanket, bringing with it an unexpected calm. Jose's persistent cough had finally subsided, his small chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm as he slept curled against his sister. Ruth Garcia had succumbed to exhaustion at last, her vigilance surrendering to the deep sleep that had eluded her for days. Her face, usually etched with worry, looked younger in repose, the firelight casting soft shadows across her features. Miguel Santos sat alone by the hearth, stoking the embers with a worn iron poker. The flames illuminated the old photograph he placed on the rough-hewn table beside him, a window into another life, another time. His calloused fingers traced the edges of the frame, lingering on the image of the woman with bright eyes, the boy who never grew up, and himself, a stranger with almost smiling lips. The cabin creaked and settled around him, a familiar symphony he'd grown accustomed to during his years of solitude. But miles down the mountain trail, a different kind of night was unfolding. Carlos Duarte moved with purpose, a lantern swinging from his hand, casting eerie shadows through the dense forest. The rifle slung across his back knocked against his spine with each step, a constant reminder of his intentions. His lips curled into a grin that held no warmth, only calculation. The snow crunched beneath his boots, marking a path that led directly to the cabin and to Jose. Back inside the shelter, Miguel's body tensed before his mind could identify why. Years of living alone on the mountain had honed his instincts to a razor's edge. Something had shifted in the night air, a disturbance in the natural rhythm of the wilderness. He set down the poker and moved silently to the window, peering through frost-laced glass at the darkness beyond. Nothing moved, yet everything felt wrong. The recluse returned to his chair, this time with his rifle across his knees. He listened to Ruth humming softly in her sleep, a melody without words that somehow conveyed everything she couldn't say while awake. Jose stirred briefly, reaching out with small fingers until they found his sister's hand. The boy settled immediately at her touch, secure in the knowledge that she remained beside him. Miguel watched them, these children who had appeared at his door with nothing but hope and desperation. In just days, they had transformed his silent refuge into something that almost resembled a home. He felt a protectiveness rising in his chest, unfamiliar yet instinctive, as he acknowledged what his heart already knew. Peace was always a fleeting thing on the mountain, and he would defend this fragile moment of tranquility with everything he had. Outside, the wind whispered warnings through the pines as Carlos drew ever closer, his footsteps purposeful, his intentions clear. The knock came after midnight, 3 hard, certain raps that echoed through the cabin like thunder. Miguel Santos set his jaw, grabbed his rifle, and motioned for Ruth to take Jose to the back corner. The girl nodded, scooping her brother into her arms without a word, her eyes wide but steady. Miguel stepped onto the porch, rifle positioned against his shoulder, breath clouding in the frigid air. "Who's there?" he called, voice rough from years of disuse. A figure emerged from the darkness, lantern held high, illuminating a weathered face with cold eyes. Carlos Duarte. "We need to talk." Miguel kept his distance, rifle unwavering. "I don't know you." Carlos smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "No, but I know the children you're harboring." He stepped forward, boots crunching in the snow. "That boy belongs to me. The girl ran off with him, stole what's rightfully mine." "Children aren't property," Miguel replied, his voice dangerously low. "His mother owed me," Carlos continued, spinning elaborate tales of debt and obligation. "Before she died, she promised the boy would work it off. It's a matter of honor." Inside, Ruth pressed her ear to the door, one hand covering Jose's mouth to keep him quiet. The boy trembled against her, his small body radiating fear. "You want the boy? Come with papers," Miguel said, standing like a mountain between the stranger and the cabin door. "You want the girl? She'll choose. But tonight, you're leaving empty-handed." Carlos's face darkened. "You don't understand what you're getting into, old man. I have friends. We can make things difficult." "I've lived difficult," Miguel answered. "It doesn't scare me anymore." The standoff stretched, cold air crackling between them. Carlos finally lowered his lantern, but his voice carried a promise. "I'll be back, with papers or with men, whatever it takes." "I'll be waiting," Miguel replied. After Carlos disappeared down the mountain path, Miguel returned inside. Ruth stood in the center of the room. Jose clutched to her chest, her face a mask of determination and fear. "He's lying," she whispered. "Mama never owed him anything. He wanted Jose to work in his mine." "Boys with small hands can reach places men can't." Miguel nodded, understanding the unspoken horror. "You're safe here." "For how long?" Ruth asked, her voice steady despite everything. Miguel checked his ammunition, his movements deliberate and calm. "For as long as needed." Inside, Ruth held Jose tight against her chest, whispering reassurances into his hair. The boy clung to her, eyes squeezed shut against the world. They both knew the truth couldn't be bought or sold, but they also knew men like Carlos Duarte didn't stop until they got what they wanted, or until someone stopped them for good. As dawn broke, Miguel Santos moved with purpose around the cabin, gathering supplies and checking his rifle. He placed ammunition on the table, and motioned Ruth over. "You need to learn," he said, demonstrating how to load the weapon. Ruth watched intently, her small hands mimicking his movements with surprising precision. "You listen good," Miguel commented, impressed by her focus. "I watch better," she replied, her eyes never leaving the rifle. For an hour, he taught her to aim, to breathe before pulling the trigger, to respect the weapon's power. The girl absorbed everything, asking questions that revealed her quick mind. Jose sat quietly in the corner, watching his sister with wide eyes. By midday, dark clouds rolled in from the north. The wind picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the shutters. Miguel glanced outside, his weathered face grim. "Storm's coming," he muttered, "and not just the weather." Ruth understood immediately. "Carlos?" Miguel nodded, barricading the door with a heavy wooden beam. He moved methodically around the cabin, checking windows, positioning furniture as barriers, laying out extra ammunition within easy reach. "Come here," he called to both children, lifting a worn rug to reveal a trapdoor. "Root cellar. If things go bad, you take Jose down here." He pressed a small pistol into Ruth's hand. Her fingers closed around it without hesitation. "If it comes to that, you know what to do," he said softly. Ruth nodded, the weapon steady in her grip. "I know." The hours crawled by as the storm intensified. Wind shrieked like a wounded animal, snow blinding anyone foolish enough to be outside. Inside, they waited in tense silence. Jose huddled against his sister, Miguel by the window, rifle across his knees. Near midnight, they heard them. Voices carried on the wind, the crunch of boots in snow. 3 men, maybe 4. Carlos Duarte's voice rose above the others, slurring with drink and malice. The first shot shattered a window. Miguel returned fire immediately, his movements precise despite years of solitude. Ruth pulled Jose toward the trapdoor, but before they could reach it, the back door splintered open. Miguel roared, charging forward to intercept the intruder. Ruth raised her pistol, protecting her brother with her body. The cabin filled with shouts and gunfire. When the last shot echoed and silence fell, Ruth emerged from behind an overturned table. Jose clutched to her chest. Miguel stood in the doorway, blood streaming from a cut above his eye, but alive. 3 bodies remained in the cabin, theirs. Bruised, breathing, but together. Miguel slumped against the wall, looking at the children, at Ruth's fierce eyes, at Jose's small hand reaching for him. For the first time in years, Miguel Santos felt something crack open inside his chest. This was what family meant, not blood, but choice. Not perfection, but protection. These children were now his to guard, to raise, to love, and he would not fail them.